Good morning, I'm Taylor Wilson, and today is Saturday, December 30th, 2023. This is The Excerpt. Today, we look at the state ballot questions Donald Trump faces in the new year. Plus, Ohio's governor vetoes a bill dealing with transgender medical care and sports. And we look at a government plan that involves hunting one type of owl to save another. California will include former president and current GOP frontrunner Donald Trump on its primary ballot next year. The decision follows very different ones in Colorado and Maine earlier this month. I caught up with USA Today national political correspondent David Jackson for more on what the state ballot fight will look like for Trump in 2024. David, appreciate you hopping on as always.
Sure. Thanks for having me.
So, David, what did officials in Maine decide this week about Donald Trump's ballot eligibility in that state, and how does it compare with what we previously saw out of Colorado?
They're similar. It's just that different offices made the decisions. But in Maine, Thursday night, there was a sudden announcement from the Secretary of State's office that, in their view, Donald Trump is not qualified to be president because of the anti-insurrection amendment within the U.S. Constitution. So, therefore, he shouldn't be on the state's ballot. This was basically the same decision that the Colorado State Supreme Court made earlier this month. But it's important to point out that Trump isn't off the ballot in either state yet. Both the Colorado court and the Maine Secretary of State have stayed their decisions pending the appeals that the Trump forces are no doubt going to make. So basically, we're still a long ways off from Trump being off the ballot, and it's a decision that's probably going to be made by the U.S. Supreme Court sometime in the months ahead.
Yeah, you mentioned the appeals process here, David. What can we expect here? What does the appeals process look like in Colorado and Maine on these issues?
But here again, it's different in both places. It's very complex, but basically the Colorado State Supreme Court decision, that has to be appealed to the U.S. Supreme Court. That's the direct line of appeal, and that's the one that Republicans are taking. In Maine, like I say, it was a decision made by the Secretary of State. So the Trump forces are going to make what they call a legal objection with the Maine court system. So basically, they'll have to go through the Maine courts before we can get to the U.S. Supreme Court. But there seems little doubt that both of these cases are eventually going to wind up in the High Court of the United States.
David, we've talked a lot about two states. What might happen to this Trump ballot question in other states? I know some others have rejected moves to keep him off the ballot.
I would say there's at least a dozen states, 12 to 15 states, where various efforts are being made to keep Trump off the ballot. As you mentioned, some states like Michigan and Minnesota have already rejected these attempts, but there's still lawsuits that are alive in places like Arizona, Nevada. I believe there's up to a dozen states where there's some kind of legal action involving an effort to keep Trump from the ballot. So what we're looking for now is to see if any other states join Colorado and Maine on this bandwagon of trying to ban the former president from their ballots. And if that happens, then that will be another case that will no doubt wind up before the U.S. Supreme Court.
And we know Trump has already used legal issues on the campaign trail. How might he use these ballot issues on the campaign trail in the coming months?
Just like he's used all the indictments against him, he's going to argue that its enemies in the federal government are going after him, using the legal system to try to derail his presidential campaign. It feeds right into the argument he's been making ever since his first indictment back in March. And in fact, the Trump people feel like that these new efforts to keep him off the ballot will help him make the case that the criminal cases against him are political. So he's going to be talking about this just as much as we are.
David, what will happen if Trump is convicted in the new year? What might that mean for these ballot questions?
They will keep coming up, basically. In the short term, most people feel like the Supreme Court will dismiss the actions of Colorado and Maine to try to keep him off the ballot. I think they're going to rule that Trump hasn't even been charged with insurrection and that the insurrection amendment in question doesn't really apply to presidential candidates. But remember that the former president is on the hook for up to 4 criminal trials during this 2024 campaign year. And 2 of those cases involve efforts to steal the election of 2020, the actions that led to the insurrection of January 6, 2021. So there's a feeling out there among both the Trump campaign and lawyers who oppose him that if he's convicted of trying to steal the election, that once again there will be lawsuits challenging his right to be on the general election ballot because he has been convicted of contributing to an insurrection. So basically, we'll go through this entire process again. If Trump is nominated, and if he's in fact convicted in a court of law, I suspect that you will see more lawsuits to try to keep him off the ballot in the fall.
David Jackson is a national political correspondent for USA Today. Thank you, David.
Great. Thank you, sir. Appreciate it.
Ohio Republican Governor Mike DeWine yesterday vetoed legislation that would have banned transgender girls from female sports and restricted the medical care of transgender minors. House Bill 68 cleared the state's House and Senate earlier this month and would have prevented doctors from prescribing hormones, puberty blockers, or gender reassignment surgery before patients turn 18. It also would have prohibited transgender girls and women from playing on female sports teams in high school and college. DeWine said, quote, "Were I to sign House Bill 68 or were House Bill 68 to become law, Ohio would be saying that the government knows better what is medically best for a child than the two people who love that child the most, their parents," unquote. DeWine's decision came after he visited children's hospitals, spoke with families, and reviewed testimony for and against the legislation. He said his administration will draft rules to ban surgery for patients under 18, collect data on transgender medical care, and restrict pop-up clinics that don't provide adequate mental health counseling. Videos taken from Ventura, California, captured the moment Thursday that a scary rogue wave jumped a seawall and slammed people and even cars in its path. 8 people were injured in the incident, and residents in nearby neighborhoods were asked to leave. One video opens on a seemingly peaceful scene as people scatter along the seawall while leaning against it and watching rolling waves in the distance. But then suddenly, people can be seen walking and then running away as the wave quickly moves over the seawall and across city blocks, sweeping some off their feet. A National Weather Service meteorologist said that a storm system over the Pacific is churning up swells, and local Weather Service offices along the coast have issued warnings and watches, as has the office in Honolulu in Hawaii. You can check out the video of the rogue wave from Ventura with a link in today's show notes. Federal officials want to hunt one type of owl to save another. I spoke with USA Today national correspondent Trevor Hughes to learn more. Trevor, thanks for hopping back on the Excerpt.
Absolutely. Happy to be here.
So, Trevor, what are barred owls and how invasive are they?
Well, barred owls are a very common owl we see in America, and you have to think of them in the context of their very closely related cousins, the spotted owls. Now, barred owls live pretty much everywhere in this country, but spotted owls only live in a small part of the country in Northern California and in the Pacific Northwest. The issue is that as European settlers moved west across this country, they started pushing the barred owls into territory that used to be exclusively held by the spotted owls. And because the barred owls are bigger, stronger, and they eat a lot more and they reproduce faster, they are starting to really put pressure on the reproductive abilities and the territory of these spotted owls.
Yeah, and so, Trevor, what are officials planning to do to relieve some of that pressure you're talking about?
Well, what makes this particular situation controversial is that spotted owls are protected under the Endangered Species Act. Barred owls are not. And so government officials say they have a legal obligation to protect the spotted owls from predators, from people, from logging. And so as a result, they're talking about shotgunning tens of thousands of barred owls to make sure that spotted owls still have a place to live.
And did officials look into any alternatives as a solution here?
As you might expect, this is very controversial. And so officials did look at a number of different options, some of which are included just not doing anything. But the issue is that if they didn't do anything, they said the spotted owls could go extinct in relatively few years because we're only talking about a few thousand of them that exist anyway. So officials looked at a whole variety of approaches, and that included scaring them away, trapping them, sending them to zoos, or even feeding them birth control so that they stopped reproducing. And all of those were sort of considered and rejected as either impractical or incredibly expensive. And so they settled on hunters with 12-gauge shotguns.
Yeah, and you mentioned this hunting plan is controversial. What do critics say about it, Trevor?
Well, let's also be clear that everything involving spotted owls is controversial. They have long been this source of tension between Republicans and Democrats as a sort of microcosm over how we protect endangered species and who we give more weight to, humans or animals. Because The spotted owl protections that exist in the country today have really taken a lot of land out of circulation for logging, which had huge financial impacts in the Pacific Northwest.
What's the historical context around spotted owls specifically? I know they've been a part of this kind of conversation around wildlife solutions and more for some time.
Right. Federal officials have been trying to protect them under the Endangered Species Act for generations, for decades. And they have, in some ways, become something of a hot potato back and forth between Republican and Democratic administrations. President Bush the first, President Bush the second, Donald Trump, Joe Biden, President Obama, President Clinton, they've all gotten involved in this spotted owl protection effort.
Trevor Hughes, great insight as always. Thanks so much.
Happy to be here.
It's New Year's Eve weekend, and just like the 4th of July, that means fireworks in some places. But with the fun of fireworks comes stress for pets. It's so severe for some that, according to a survey from the American Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Animals, loud noises like fireworks or thunderstorms are the cause for nearly 1 in 5 lost pets. Advice for keeping your pet calm includes keeping at least one human home with them to pet or console the animal. Or you could try an anxiety-reducing device like a thunder shirt, which is like a weighted blanket. Another idea, take your dog for a walk earlier before you expect fireworks to start. You can read more tips and tricks with a link in today's show notes. And be sure to stay tuned to the excerpt tomorrow when my co-host Dana Taylor sits down with USA Today national political correspondent Philip M. Bailey to take a deep dive look at the 2024 election. You can find the episode right here on this feed. And thanks for listening to The Excerpt. You can get the podcast wherever you get your pods. And if you use a smart speaker, just ask for The Excerpt. I'm Taylor Wilson, back Monday with more of The Excerpt from USA Today.